Hello there. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Small Press and the Art of Bookmaking, the final panel on our first ever in the history of this universe, Meet the Press's Indie Lit Symposium. It's been a really great 4 days so far, and we'd be grateful for your feedback if you've been to other events. My name is Stuart Ross. I'm the publisher of Proper Tales Press and a founding member of the Meet the Presses Collective, and I will be your not your referee, but in fact your host for this afternoon. First though, I'd like to acknowledge that while we are gathering here in a virtual space, Meet the Presses does most of its work on the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabeg, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat peoples, and now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. We acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 with the Mississaugas of the Credit, and we encourage you to learn the history of the land you are currently on as we reflect on the past and acknowledge the changes that can be made going forward in the process of truth and reconciliation. In a moment, I'll be welcoming our panelists to our virtual stage, but before that, I'll let you know what to expect for the next hour. The first half of the event will include a moderated discussion with our panelists, and we discuss the nearly infinite physical possibilities and design imagination of small press publishing. The Q&A portion of the event will happen during the last 15 to 20 minutes, and you are invited to use the Q&A box. You'll see in the, I think it's in the middle at the bottom of your screen there, the Q&A box to ask your question. If you feel like chatting or heckling with other attendees or other panelists or me, please use the chat box throughout the event. If you're leaving a message you'd like all attendees to see, be sure to select the drop down that says all panelists and attendees. This event is closed captions. To enable captions, just press closed caption button at the bottom of your screen. So here we are. This panel will be exploring the design and other physical aspects of small press and micropress publications, what sets them apart from mainstream publishing, for example. So if you're about to start up your own press, which is something I highly recommend, or if you're already publishing, this is the place to be right now. And it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our gang of accomplished panelists. We'll hear from each of them. I've asked them each to tell a little bit about the background of their press and to do a little bit of a show and tell for a few minutes, just so you can familiarize yourself with who's here. We'll start off with Karen Schindler. Karen is the editor and publisher of London-based Baseline Press, which has published dozens of limited edition, hand-sewn, exquisite poetry chapbooks since 2011. Take it away, Karen.
Thanks, Stuart. And thank you to Meet the Presses for creating this online space for us this weekend in lieu of our in-person book fair, which we're all missing. And also thanks to the behind-the-scene folks, Tally and Aaron and everyone who's been working so hard to make this event and the days leading up to it. So Baseline is a micropress, a poetry micropress based out of London, Ontario. I started up Baseline in 2011. So this year we have just finished launching our 10th season of books. And next year there are 7 titles on the roster. So by the end of 2021, we will have published 54 titles. And in the early years, we did a few letterpress broadsides, but at this point, we're pretty much strictly poetry chapbooks. Baseline typically aims for 3 to 6 titles every year, and the run sizes are small. They're between 60 and 75 copies. Although we have done a couple bigger projects, 200, 300 copies of a title, but those were special collaborative situations and not the norm. Baseline, I think of it very much as a community-based small press. I get so much support from the London literary scene, which is amazing and vibrant and has audiences that overlap in wonderful ways. And then I also need to mention the support I get from the London Arts Council, who have been funding Baseline since year 2, which I know a lot of small presses don't have, and I'm very grateful for. And the other thing I would say about Baseline is that I place a lot of importance on design and construction. The look of Baseline books really hasn't changed too much since that first year. We did 3 books in 2011. This one is The Black Car by Christine Wald, and it's a little smaller than Baseline books are now, but it kind of set the tone with the Saint Armand cover stock, and then a decorative flyleaf inside, and a very simple 3-hole stitch, pamphlet stitch to bind it. So that was one of the first. And then a more recent book would be Isabella Wang's On Forgetting a Language. So it's a little larger in terms of the height of the cover, but very similar design with, you know, a pretty clean cover design, and sometimes a splash of color inside. And I admire what other presses are doing with more detailed focus, or more focus on details. You'll see what Michael is doing with Puddles of Sky, all these little envelopes tucked into books, and certainly In Print Collective, they have that amazing series of 8 books that Maureen will be talking about, with just gorgeous materials. And for Baseline, it's a matter of a balance between my desire to get the work out there and to produce a reasonable number of copies. That's always pushing up against my interest in maybe just playing a bit with the design detail. But looking forward, I may be going to narrow down the amount of books on each roster, so I might have more time to spend on that. And I'll leave it at that for now, Stuart.
Thank you so much, Karen. All right. Next up, we'll hear from Michael E. Casteels. Michael is the editor and publisher of the Kingston, Ontario-based Puddles of Sky Press, a purveyor of chapbooks, ephemera, comics, and zines, tiny and large, since 2006. Michael.
Hey, thanks, Stuart. Yeah, so when you asked me to talk about the origin of Puddles of Sky Press, I started thinking about it more last night, and I think there's probably 3 main points of origin for the press. The first point was before I even got into the poetry scene. This was right out of high school, and some friends of mine and I were doing more like political zine things. This was sort of at a time when we didn't have access to our own computers all the time. People didn't have cell phones, no access to internet at all times. A friend of mine wasn't living at home, so whenever he needed to use the internet, his dad would give him a key to his office. He worked at a radio station in Coburg, so that my friend could go in after hours and use the internet. Instead, what we did is we went in after hours and used their photocopying machine. And we'd spend like hours taking our cut and paste, scissors and glue zines and photocopying them there. And that was the first real taste of printing that I had. And we learned a lot about printing, mostly how to clear paper jams. I think at different points we had the photocopier machine basically torn apart so we could make sure we weren't leaving any little scraps and sheets behind. And so that was really sort of the start of me doing anything with the printing press. A few years after that, I was living in Peterborough, and a friend of mine, Andrew Nurse, and I, we were both doing poetry zines, and we wanted to have something to sort of fuse our efforts together, and we thought coming up with a small press, even just having a name, would give us some legitimacy to publish together and to host readings in Peterborough. So it's kind of, again, to sort of fuse our efforts, fuse sort of our materials. One of us had a long arm stapler, another one had a big abundance of paper and a printer we could use. So gathering those supplies together was sort of the main means of producing our work at that point. And that was still very zine based. So again, scissors and glue, cut and paste, photocopying. The Puddles the Sky press that you guys sort of see today really did come to life more when I moved to Kingston, and actually I met Stuart at Queen's University when he was the writer in residence there. And Stuart was the one to introduce me to chapbooks and sort of how they differ from zines. And after a few meetings with Stuart, he sort of piled me up with some of his Proper Tales things and introduced me to the literary scene. Really, I had no idea that other people were doing this type of thing. He got me tuned into the Ottawa crowd, so I got up to the Small Press Fair in Ottawa, where I met a bunch of really great people, met a bunch of people in Toronto. And from there, that was sort of where the chapbook press really started. And from there, I've really gone into different directions. I started off doing more digital designs, printing from home. And now I do a lot more hands-on. A lot of what I'm doing now is rubber stamp publications. I'd say probably like 80% of the publications I've done in the last few years have been all rubber stamped and all like basically handmade. And that's sort of where I'm moving more towards these days. And that's sort of the origins of Puddles the Sky Press.
Just show us a couple of your publications.
Yeah, so I've got two, well, I've got a pile on hand here, but these are the ones that are on the Meet the Press's website. So I'm gonna see if I can switch my camera view here. So this is one of them. It's the most recent publication that I did, and it's called Words in Place by Cameron Anstey. And it's a pretty tiny publication. It's a one-word chapbook, so I call these ones chat poems. And it's about maybe 2 inches by 2.5 inches. And a lot of what I'm doing right now is all offcuts and loose ends. So if you've seen my introduction video on the Meet the Presses playlist, you can see it. So I'm taking all the basically scrap paper that I end up with from other presses or from other projects or paper that people give to me. And I use that to create small booklets. So a lot of this is paper that can't be run through a printer. So the best way to utilize that is through the rubber stamps. And then the other publication that I've done most recently utilizing the rubber stamps is the literature issue 8. And so this is, again, all rubber stamped. And it sort of comes in this cardstock envelope. And then it's just got a bunch of these tiny publications. I think there's 11 of them, all rubber stamped by different people. And I really am a big fan of tangibility in printing. That's, I think one of the main goals is to create books and publications that you could never recreate with something digital, something you could never read on a Kobo reader, or you couldn't get a PDF of something like this. So I like books or publications that you need to open and you need to, you know, pull apart. I like creating poetry experiences for people and kind of fusing the print form with the poem itself. So this is a poem, sort of a haiku. So it's a twig snaps, the silence. So trying to do little things like that, it allows me to be very creative and to have a lot of fun with it. So that's, again, sort of where I'm working from these days.
Thanks very much, Michael.
Yeah, thank you.
And our third panelist is Maureen Silva, who I'm meeting for the first time now. Maureen is manager and artist with the InPrint Collective, a Toronto-based group of printmakers who have been making amazing things since 2008, exploring all aspects of print through their publications, their workshops, and their artist talks. Maureen.
Hi, thanks for having me. I feel a little bit like an outlier because we very much are actually a printmaking group and not a press in this sense, even though we operate with presses. We have a litho press, we have tabletop presses, and we're screen printers as well. And we actually didn't have a studio to work from until 2018, and the timing of that worked out because we got these grants to support poetry in print, which allowed us to sort of play with publishing. So we basically functioned as a pop-up group in terms of projects for many years, working with community museums, basically coming up with a project when we could get funding for it. And having a studio space has really changed that dramatically for us. And that's where we get to poetry in print. So this was a really sort of fun project where we wanted to sort of propose a writer's residency in a printmaking studio. So we wanted it to be a very hands-on experience. And the basis of this was on two things. That on the technical side, it was focusing on the materiality and the interdisciplinarity of creating a book. Poetry in Print brought together 8 visual artists with 8 local poets in partnership with local author Jacqueline Valencia, who's on the, I believe, the committee for Meet the Presses. And that was super important because, as I said, we're visual artists and not literary people. So we needed that connection to the community so we would know what we were doing and we would have writers to outreach to. And together we hand printed and hand bound original bookworks in edition of 53. And we really did take the perspective that these were artworks specifically. And maybe we can have a conversation about that in a bit, because I know going to school and taking my artist books class, I remember doing a presentation on graphic novels and being told that that wasn't art, that that was literature. So I find those silos very interesting, especially as a printmaker, because printmaking and bookbinding and literature are very naturally married together. But when we did this project, everybody was kind of like, oh, what a great idea. I'm like, I stole it from Gutenberg 400 years ago. I'm not that original. But it's just interesting the way that we perceive books versus art. So we very much took the art perspective. And you see that reflected in our price, and I will defend that price till my last breath. The other side about this project, though, was also thinking about the canons of CanLit and the visual art world and who gets to take up that space. And a book is a great metaphor for taking up space. You have to think about it physically, and but it also affects you emotionally and intellectually. And the time that we started developing this grant, which was long before we actually got the grant, a lot of interesting things were happening. So in the visual art side of the world, we were finding Hyperallergic was reporting on a number of women directors of major institutions getting fired. And the reason that they were getting fired was because they were seen as too political or too much. And we thought that was really interesting because that's not a charge level that a lot of male CEOs in the art world. And then also on the CanLit side, there was, the proclamation by, who I will not name, by a professor at U of T, who said that there were no good women writers to teach in modern English class. And also hearing about other Black writers who felt that they had to quit CanLit because it was racist. So we wanted this to be a thing where we could make that space and we could program from that perspective. So all our programming and outreach, we thought about decolonization, we thought about intersectional feminism, and we thought about anti-racist work in terms of the workshops that we provided for our participants. And we also thought about that in our outreach and who got to actually participate in this residency. So we were able, through the grants, to pay everybody to participate. And it was just a really sort of interesting dive in where the poets actually got to learn how to print make and how to bookbind. So every single book, the pairing really actually, they bound them themselves. So I'll show you a couple of them. This is one by Leah Sandals and Shirley Ampagi, and this is done in the stab bound style. So what's really neat about this, especially if you're a beginner bookbinder, is that you actually don't have to pre-plan your pages because you just print on single leaf paper and you bind them together. So this was really nice if you find producing your own book intimidating. This is a very simple pattern that's very nice and very sturdy, but you can just work on an individual page and not have to think about the whole book to the end. And this was silk screened. So in this case, and poets and artists work together in various ways. So they took turns sort of just developing images and poetry in tandem. So the visual aspect of the book was really important. These are beautiful Canson Nutent paper covers. and Japanese washi. So even though this looks deceptively thin, this is like a 3-layer silkscreen with like a really heavy ink, and the paper just took it. So these are qualities that we promote in these books as artists. Another one, this is Evidence by Catherine Tamaro and Andrea Thompson. So this was also really neat. Again, the same sort of style, but they letter pressed their covers. So the tactility of this is, it's nice. You can rub your hand over it and you can feel it, and it's lovely. And then we have the poems printed on this vellum, so you can sort of see them overlaid on top of images that were printed with pronto plate lithography. So this is just printing these images was probably about 30 hours of work, just printing. And then we have a lot of other different styles. So I'll just show you another option. Book Detached by Micah Behuizenwenger and Dominique Russell, and you can see that they really sort of played with that. This is the same stitch, but it gave them that option. Again, beautiful paper, delicate drawings. We also made accordion books. So this is the one that I made called A Great Thunder, and we decided this would just be one poem that spread across, and it was called A Great Thunder, and I was thinking to myself, like, I don't want to do something that's super obvious with the imagery, so I thought thunder, electricity, how does electricity express itself on the body? Through your hair. So I photocopied mine and my poet Arma's hair, and I silk screened it, and there's actually a glow-in-the-dark layer, so that if you were to have this book displayed in your living room and you turned off the light, the book would light up. So that was another one. Here's another great one. This one's, I'll show you Jackie Valencia's. The menu, so this one was thinking about food culture. Also very beautifully printed with gold ink. We have a Coptic book. So this was rare. So this is by Angela Fidel and Bijal Prajapati. And so the Coptic book, I can't even show you the stitching. It's really hard. This was very, very labor intensive. This is a stitching you normally do with a hardcover, so kudos to them for getting it done. But if you go through it, you can see that they also would play with the paper quite a bit. So I'm just trying to find, I'm gonna take a lot of time, sorry guys. So this is actually a poem, but it becomes a different poem when you open it up. All right. And then we also have our simple pamphlet stitch, which is also really nice and effective. This is a cyanotype cover. This is by Vanessa Vinaswaramurthy and Amy St. John. And again, we also have that playing with the experience of the poem. I like that from Michael, I'll steal that. So there's a blackout poem in here as well. And a lot of hardcore print work. This is a lot of text to print as a screen print. I'm just gonna throw that out there. Also interesting ways that artists worked with each other. This is called Vice Versa. And so the artist in this case, the artist did 5 images and the poet responded, and then they did the vice versa. So when you open the book, you get one perspective and then you have to flip it around to get another perspective. And they're just such wonderful poems and image. Oh, of course I opened it to a blank page.
You know, Maureen, I'm going to pause you at that one. That was Elise Friedman. That's the one I have. I love that one. Thank you so much. I did want to just quickly, before I start asking a few questions, go back to Karen just to see a couple more of the publications that you've done through Baseline, Karen.
Well, I can talk a bit about the covers, which are, I really can't take a lot of credit for, because the design of Baseline books is such a collaboration between publisher and poet. I have a specific line of cover stock that I like using, which is from Montreal, the Saint Armand Canal line. But within that line, there's a nice range of textures, and they seem to focus on neutrals, but there's some great colors that the authors can choose from. But the authors are always the ones that seem to bring this amazing cover art to the projects. Wow. And sometimes it's a matter of the poet being an artist. So Celia Englert, for example, last year did a collage that we then used as the cover art. Xiao Yang from a few years ago did her cover art for Reunions in the Air of the Sheep. or if an artist or an author rather doesn't have their own piece of art, they often have a friend who's a terrific artist. So they'll ask a friend to do a piece for the project. This is Joseph Mulholland's Phantom Ride, and the artwork was done by his friend Florian Brozak. Last year, Emily Liu was following an artist she admired on Twitter, Alyssa Chan, and she actually sent her manuscript to, she didn't know Alyssa, but she contacted her and sent her manuscript to Alyssa, and Alyssa did an original piece for Emily's Night Leaves Nothing New. Or in some cases, if the poet doesn't have anything special in mind, I'll have a favorite artist who I think might work well with a given collection. Anne-Marie Terz's book, Slip Minute, from last year, there's a collage artist, Lorraine Mohar, who I really admire, and we asked Lorraine if we could use one of her pieces, and then Anne-Marie herself had the idea of presenting it in this grid pattern. And then when we got to the flyleaf decision, Anne-Marie chose this mustard grid patterned flyleaf to kind of speak to the cover matrix. So the covers always just seem to fall into place, and I take no credit for the way that happens. It feels like that the poets really do most of the work. Poets have a good eye, and I rely on that. I admit that my comfort is with sort of a center justified design. My authors will probably attest to that, but and it's not just the covers, but the flyleaf decisions and the cover fonts, even the text fonts inside the book, layout decisions. It's all a really joint experience.
Well, you say you get credit for the covers necessarily, but you're certainly a great facilitator of collaboration and inspiring creativity among your writers. I'm just going to mention before I dig into a couple of other questions, you've actually all answered a whole bunch of my questions already without my asking them, which is nice. Behind me there is a painting by a great micropresser and artist, Barbara Caruso. And Barbara, about 50 years ago, ran two micropresses, Cerapress and Press. And what she did with those two different presses were just incredible artists' work as well. So I wanted to mention that. A couple of you, or one of you, has touched on it, and there's been a little bit of talk in the chat here about politics. And it was my last question, and I'm going to push it up to the first question. Does any kind of politics or response to capitalism or that kind of thing enter into your approach to publishing? Is something that you are conscious of, or something you're attempting to do consciously, respond politically in any way? Anyone would like to take that on?
Everything we do is political. I mean, and that went down to everything. Like we know we operate in a capitalist system, and again, that even came up in the price of our books. Like I know that we charge a lot more, but it was an acknowledgement of the up to 60 hours individual artists put into the books and making sure that they got paid for their output. We also paid our artists to participate, which is not always available with residencies. And again, it wasn't even nearly what they deserved because I was limited into how many grants I could get to support the project. It took me 2 years to get just under $20,000. And that was with generous support from places like Speedball Art sending us inks to print as well. And like it was about $1,000 of just materials of that grant. So we do think about that all the time, and that's why it was important that our outreach was well done and that we hit certain voices that we could help support and represent. The way that we did workshops for our artists was political. Like, yeah, these are the things we want to talk about. These are the stories we want to hear. This is the way we want to take up space. And to acknowledge that right now in print, we've had a lot of lineup changes, and our current lineup for the last couple of years has been quite white. hasn't always been, but it certainly is in this moment. And so we need to acknowledge that when we do our projects and we work with the community, that we make that a safe space for other people to join us, so it doesn't stay white. So absolutely, everything we do, even the stuff we put up on Etsy that's just supposed to be fun, it's always operating in the system of this world that we're not separate from.
Thank you so much, Maureen. Michael or Karen, any response to that question?
I guess for me, I did kind of touch on it a little bit earlier, but a lot of what I'm doing with my press is sort of my quiet rage against the Amazon machine, or I guess even less than that, but just like the digification of publications, and sort of working towards tangibility, and working towards things that you can just sort of create on your own, and hoping that when people pick up my publications and see them, they think that it's something that they could potentially do themselves. And I think that sort of influencing people who are not publishing their own work or their friends' work is sort of a political act in itself.
And just to follow up on what Michael was saying, I do like the idea that, or the fact that this level of publishing does seem to be, we can carry on kind of outside the struggles that larger publishers might have. I don't think success at this level of publishing is measured by book sales. It's more creating that authentic experience between the reader and the writer and the publisher. So I don't see chapbook publishers as being part of the marketplace where things are dictated from the top down. We can certainly play around with technology, and I see lots of chapbook publishers moving things online, but there's not a pressure to follow a trend. I think with this level of publishing, things like ebooks don't threaten us maybe the way they would with larger publishers. And I think that's certainly part of the appeal.
Yeah, great answers across the board there. Thank you. Karen, your chapbooks, yours and Cameron Anstey's Apartment 9 Press and your Baseline Press chapbooks, I think are probably like they're very, very recognizably the chapbooks you do, and I think both of you and Cameron do like the most beautiful, chapbooks around in that kind of with a standardized design, I guess I would say, though in both your cases the sizes change a bit. But my question for all of you is: are you concerned with making your publications recognizable as something that comes from your press? I don't want to use the word branding, but I just did. But maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
I'd say for me, it's almost the opposite. I'd like to try to create something that I haven't done before, maybe something that isn't recognizable. And I think a lot of that does come out of the Offcuts and Loose Ends project right now, because I'm sort of responding to the paper or the materials that I have. And so if I end up with like a project like this, so this is a chapbook that I did a few years ago, a visual poetry by Andrew Topel, and it has a cutout in the front, and then it's all these sort of framed works. So when I did the cutout here, I ended up with a bunch of these little squares, which then I used to create a chapbook by Allison Chisholm, my wife, called 99 Cents. And you wouldn't, they might be on the table together, but you wouldn't necessarily recognize that they're from the same press, let alone the same piece of paper. And I think that for me, it's sort of the most fun I can have is trying something new with every project. And I think if I was creating the same chapbook over and over, it would be less of a challenge, or less get my creative gears working a little bit less than how I'm responding to the paper now, which is for me the most fun part of publishing.
Responding to the paper. Great. Thank you so much. How about you, Maureen, with that, the Poets and Artists project? Was there a concern of having any degree of uniformity or recognizability as in-print publications?
I mean, I think people would recognize an in-print publication simply for its hand-printed qualities and what's available in our studio. So most of our books had been printed with a screen print. But I think a lot of it's also shaped by the artists that we invite, and they'll bring things to the table that I wouldn't have considered. So if I think about, like, this was actually an extra project that one of the poets did who fell in love with printmaking. So I felt like I won just for that. And she wrote a poem, and she figured out, I have it backwards. She figured out how to turn it into an infinity card. So thinking a lot about what Michael does. So this is an infinity card. The poem starts here. And in order to read the poem, you have to keep moving the card. And the card just moves over and over again. And it's a really cool experience. I would never have thought of that myself. I didn't even know what an infinity card was. So I feel like while there might be some recognizable elements into the way that we present print work and artwork in general, I think every time we invite different artists in, we're going to get introduced to new ideas and things that we want to promote. So this is also available on our Etsy, support local artists.
Hey, thank you. And Karen, you have really different cover artists for each of your books, or mostly. And so how do you take that into consideration for recognizably baseline books, or is that a concern for you?
Well, I'll maybe start by just saying that I really love that you mentioned Apartment 9, because when I started up in 2011, Cameron's books were the ones that I really caught my eye, and he was doing a bit more elaborate work than I ended up doing with bindings and whatnot. In fact, this would be the stab binding that Maureen was referring to. But I love the idea that I knew that he was doing everything at home on his home printers, and I knew that he was cutting the paper by himself, and that he had a look to his books, but at the same time, each book felt very individual. And I will admit that I relied a lot on what he was doing in order when I started up. I have to also say that I asked him endless questions as well that he graciously answered. And also, I'll mention a couple other presses that were instrumental when I was starting up. And it would be Jim Johnston who was with Cactus Press at the time, and Shane Nielsen and Carol Peters at Frog Hollow. Because I didn't know anything about design or publishing, I just knew that I wanted to do this. So I was writing a lot of emails and asking a lot of questions, and I immediately saw how generous this community was. But I love being thrown in the same camp as Cameron, as he was such an instrumental part of my startup. But yes, the baseline books definitely have a look, and I do hope that each author at the end of the day feels like the book is special, and I try to add the little extras as much as possible, as much as time allows. I occasionally do a little wraparound. I don't know if it will show up, but a little wraparound text on the back French flap. And as I mentioned, I'd like to incorporate more of those special details, and I hope to. But I admit that I like the idea that a baseline book looks like a baseline book.
Thank you. I'm just going to mention that we're going to, if any attendees, is that what we call the people who are not on the panel? If any attendees have any questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll go through a few of those before we end. Karen talked a little bit about her influences as a publisher, and that was another question I had here. So maybe I'll turn back to Maureen and Michael if you would each like to talk a little bit about what has influenced the physical properties, physical designs, and experiments of your own publications.
Yeah, so I think originally when I moved into chapbooks, my first inspirations were from your Proper Tales Press. They were the first ones that I saw, so that sort of learned from those. Again, I also did learn quite a bit from just studying Cameron's works, just for interior layout and for binding purposes. And then when I moved more into the hands-on and rubber stamping presses, obviously John Curry, who's seeing this, he was probably one of the biggest influences. I've got just a few of his little books right here. So just in terms of using these little offcuts, loose ends, uses like wrappers from evaporated milk or from soup cans. And I think that sort of stuff is really wonderful. And just like, I like to really close study a lot of these publications. So just to see, it's a bit like detective work, trying to figure out how the impressions work. So just little things like this, like on the back here, there would be at least 3 different stamps that he would have had to have used. One for, you know, the date and the numbers copied, his address, and then this little thing here, this little blue asterisk, that's its own impression. And I think I just learned a lot from that sort of really close reading of the books and then a close studying of how they're put together. Another one of my big influences, Stuart, you did mention Barbara Crusoe, and I've got some of her press books on hand. So this is one here, it's called Sighting Light. And recently, last month, my wife Allison and I got to go visit Nelson and Barbara's house before it sold. And I was able to come away from the house with a box of offcut and loose end papers, one of which was titled with press stock. So you can see some of the similarity, like it's pretty much the same, it is the same paper. And so using that has just been such an incredible experience. And again, it's learning the process of how these books are put together. So learning the stamping process. These books, they're so elegantly put together. One of the problems is that the print run was so small. There was like, I think sometimes only 19 copies printed, so they're really hard to come by. But I think they're just so beautifully put together, so meticulous, so perfect. So when I was working on Cameron's, and I have one of my own that I did recently, sort of buried in other books right now. But I tried to emulate that, just trying to be as precise with my cutting and my stamping as I can be. And just learning little things for all new publications. So this is the first time that I've done that. I think Karen called it a French flap. I didn't know that's what it was called. But the first time that I've done that sort of work. And I think I learned a lot just from the close study of Barbara's press work. So those are my 2 main influences right now.
Thank you. And I guess just to maybe in a sense round off the 4-day symposium, which started off with the BP Nicol Chapbook Award. I know that BP Nicol was a huge influence on J.W. Curry, who was a huge influence on you. Maureen, what about you? Do you want to talk about that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably going to be very similar to Michael's answer, where it's the structure of the book, right? And then we're also coming at it as printmakers, and those have always been 2 art forms that go hand in hand, at least for me. And the interesting thing for us was that most of us actually start in the collective. We started with hardcover books. And I thought, oh my gosh, if I made everybody make 53 hardcover books, they would kill me in this project. So it was really nice to use it as an excuse to explore softcover bindings and the possibilities with that. And even being pushed, initially we were only going to allow stab binding and pamphlet binding, just to keep it simple for everybody, knowing that a lot of the poets might not have had visual art experience, but even getting that pushback to do the accordion books. So it's really just sort of, I start with one place, and it's really just about what other people around me are also doing. And like even looking at Michael's stuff right now, I'm like, oh, I'm going to try that. I'm going to go home.
I thought the same thing.
I have so much fun. And looking at Karen's books, I'm like, oh yeah, that's gorgeous. I'm going to do that too. So it's really just, my influence is other people, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise.
Yeah. It's awesome that you are all actually are influencing each other at this very moment and being influenced by each other. That's really, really lovely. We're going to wrap up in about 15 minutes. There's so much talk in the chat, but there aren't questions because I think you are all being so incredibly interesting. If anyone does have questions, pop them into the Q&A box there. What suggestions, because I'm sure anyone who's watching now who maybe doesn't publish is now going to start a press. You know, I was watching the magazines and journals thing earlier, and while that discussion was going on, I thought, I'm going to start a new online press. Fluffy the Runt. So I went Fluffy the Runt on Blogger. So I'm going to start my magazine. So I'm guessing there's all these people about to start presses. what advice would you have for people starting micropresses? Not from the editorial standpoint, but from the standpoint of what kind of physical objects they might think of creating, or how they might come to those arrive in those designs. Anyone here like to, maybe Michael, if you want to start on that one?
Yeah, so I think just from my own experience, I would say if you want to get into printing, maybe just start hands-on. Like I find getting into doing everything digitally, designing digitally, it can be a bit much to take in. Like, you know, you're watching YouTube videos, unless you have somebody who's there to help you, it can be sort of daunting, at least it would be for me. But I think if you were to just take some 8.5 by 11, grab some poems that you've printed, cut them out with scissors, glue them on the page, go down to Staples and photocopy them. And I think you get a good idea of how a book is formed. Like, you know, the first poem on this sheet is the last poem in the book. Like it's sort of a twist in your mind when you haven't done it before. And I think doing it that way, there's no pressure. Make 10 copies to give to your friends and family. I think that's how I started. And I think that's just sort of a good way. And then as you do that, you can progress. You learn like an astounding amount from every project that you work on. So start small, start simple, have zero expectations, and just have fun with it.
Thank you. Maureen, do you have suggestions for people starting out?
Yeah, I mean, I think you just kind of jump in and make friends with writers. As a visual artist who had no idea, I just was happy that I knew Jackie, and I said, "Hey, do you want to do this?" And she's like, "Hell yeah!" And that's literally word for word transcription of our conversation. And then we just tried. So I felt lucky writing experience for other past projects. So my trying also meant I could write a grant for this, and I'm going to encourage this to everybody. I got a Toronto Arts Council literary grant, and I am not a writer, and I am not a publisher, and I got it on the first try. So my advice to you is to try and make friends while you're trying. Don't do it in isolation is what I would say as well.
Great advice from both of you so far. Karen, what about you?
Well, I would certainly echo the idea that reaching out to people in the small press community is definitely the way to go, because I think we all started up by asking for help, and so I think we all are delighted when we get the opportunity to pay it forward to a new small press starting up. So definitely reach out to other publishers. And Michael, I love that you talked about sort of just starting out with the barest of equipment, because that's certainly what I did. I did put some money into a really good German rotary cutter, paper cutter, I love, and starting up a website. But you know, I didn't want to be buying Adobe software that first year. I just I thought I would get to that eventually. So I just started out in Word, and you know, once you've got the templates, it's very easy to keep going. And at this point, I kind of get a kick out of doing the most with the least amount of technology. So I think sometimes the poets are surprised to hear that I'm not using InDesign, but you don't have to do anything fancy to do small press work. I think there's room for everything. There are certainly the presses that have very professional design teams going or working hard, but you can also do it with the bare bones and get some great results. So yeah, anyone can do it. You just have to want to.
Thank you. Thanks so much. We do have one question here, so I'm going to ask that one. Some guy named Gary Barwin asked, can you talk about your idea of number of each copy of book made beyond just the logistics of expense and labor? There's something special, says Gary, meaningful about limited runs. Maureen?
Yeah, so for us, that's a printmaking convention. If you know a print from a reproduction, because a print will be numbered. It's an edition that's made. And the idea is that once that number is done, that's it. The plate is struck, it's never made again. So with all of our books, like Karen was talking about, not using technology, we don't even have internet in our studio or a laptop. So these books, like when they're sold out, that's it, they're done. And that is a tradition from printmaking. There are such things as open editions, and because these were silk screens, we did not do that because that would hold our screens hostage for life if we did that. But for us, it's really just rooted in the visual art practice of like, this is an artwork that's not the same as copying somebody else's work off of a digital, and there's digital art is great too. I'm not knocking it, but it's not the same as just like, oh, here was the painting and here's a reproduction of that painting you can have in poster form. The artwork, the printmaking is what's part of the specialness of this, and the editioning of it is part of that. So I agree, the editioning is what helps keep the aura of an original artwork for printmaking, and we put that into these books as well.
Thank you. Michael, want to answer the same question?
Yeah, so sometimes, most of the time, my print runs are now just dictated by the amount of cardstock that I have or the amount of paper that I have for certain projects. So if I have 25 pages, it's a 25 print run. I have a hard time coming to terms with low print runs. I did one print of a chapbook by Nelson Ball a few years ago, and I think I did 17 copies, and I probably have one left. And I really like having stacks of books around me. I find it very comforting, even my own books. I mean, I like to get them out into the world. I like them not being here, but I also feel kind of sad when they're gone. Like, I made 100 of these and I have 2 left. Where are they all? Like, I have a hard time coming to terms with that. So I normally try to do maybe 50 or so. I have also come to terms with the fact that I have too many. So, you know, some of the literatures I've done 100 copies of, and I probably still have 70 copies in my office. I think probably I'm going to start to maybe do less prints of certain and more prints of others, and sort of come to that happy medium. But yeah, it is hard to say goodbye to chapbooks.
Absolutely, I totally relate to that. What about you, Karen?
Well, certainly I love the idea of this level of publishing, producing things that are ephemeral, that are not meant to be accessible forever. And I've sort of found a sweet spot, I think, when I'm looking at 60 to 75 copies, but it's something I struggle with because there are, you know, you'll publish an author one year and then the next year they'll be invited to two panels or 2 readings, and they understandably would like to have books to take with them, and so I try to accommodate reprints whenever possible. But of course, at that point, you're into your next season and you're making another roster worth of books. But I do think that that's part of the picture is that these books are not around forever. You make the run and then they're gone.
Thank you so much. I'm gonna ask one quick last wild card question. So what's that huge publishing conglomerate that's eating up all the big publishers? What it was called again? Someone? They just bought Penguin or something, or Random Penguin, Macmillan, Doubleday, whatever. So okay, so the huge conglomerate comes up and says to you, I think we'd like to start a chapbook imprint. Michael, Maureen, Karen, you in? You want to take it over? You want to do it? Chapbook imprint for Global Capitalist Press. You can do it?
If they wanted to pay me for the time that I put into it, maybe, but they might be surprised at how long it takes me to print books. And if I wanted to charge to make these, I don't know if they could afford me.
All right. What about you, Karen?
Well, it's funny you mentioned that
Oh.
because I've been, after 10 years, I'm thinking about directions I might like to go. And I've been thinking about bringing on an editorial board or possibly merging with a larger small press, not not a huge press, but so I've been talking to Insomniac about that. The idea of working with an editorial board is really appealing, and I think it would be a way to move forward in a direction that I'm excited about. So yeah, I like it's funny that you mentioned that, because I love the idea of a chapbook imprint, and I don't know if that technically exists at the moment. I know that there are some chapbook publishers who have a hand in another larger press, but I don't know if a chapbook imprint setup exists. And I think there's all sorts of possibilities for benefits to both parties. So yeah, that's something that I'm hopefully moving towards.
Both of these so far have surprised me. Mark Liberté, by the way, put in the chat here, they'll make you put a chapbook on every cover. Maureen, are you gonna give into the global monolith?
You know, if they want to give me the money, but also the control over the books, because even with poetry in print, because it was grant funded, we don't own the copyright of any of these books. We left that to the artists. The artists, if they want to republish somewhere else, up to them. And in print actually doesn't make any money off these books. The sales are split evenly between the poets and the visual artists. So, and I mean, I kind of regret that a little bit, but because it's actually quite a bit of work to take these to market and to whatever, but we've got other prints, we're good. Yeah, so I would have to consider the conditions and also who the company was. Like, I'm not sure that I would do that for Amazon. I think they're kind of monstrous, but you know, if they're not like digging oil out of indigenous sacred lands, and they're not you know, using sweatshop labor to produce the paper that they'll give me, I might consider it, with the conditions of how much everyone's going to get paid and how much artist control is there, right? I mean, I already submit to the grant system, so I'm here.
Well, in a way, you're all, instead of going into the, I would be willing to sell out, there's a bit of a, I would be willing to subvert from within, which is a really nice way of looking at it. I want to thank you all so much, Karen and Maureen and Michael, for your awesomeness and generosity and all that you've shared. It's, I'm amazed, and I admire all of the work that you've done that I've seen. So thank you for sharing your ideas about small press design, about the physicality of small press and micropress publications. I want to also thank everybody who joined us this afternoon, what do we call it again? Attendees. And it was a pleasure to have you with us, and it was great to see such lively chatting in the chat panel there. If you haven't done so yet, I encourage everyone to visit the Meet the Presses market at meetthepresses.wordpress.com and consider, if you can, purchasing some publications by these and the other small presses that have been with us during the symposium. You can also visit their websites and order direct if that's something you'd like to do. And hopefully in another year, we'll be having another Indie Lit Market in person. But I think the symposium thing should probably just keep going anyways. On behalf of the Meet the Presses Collective, which is Gary Barwin, Paul Dutton, Beth Follett, Aaron Tucker, Jacqueline Valencia, and Tally Voron, and me. Thank you again all for joining us. I also want to thank the guest moderators we've had over the past few days, Amelia Doze and Lee Nash, and also our publicist, Julie Wilson. Oh my, Aaron Tucker has written, oh, Lord Stuart, and I'm wondering, did I screw something up here? Am I okay? Oh, Lord, or are you calling me Lord Stuart? I don't really know. Okay, well, if I screwed something up, I apologize. Thank you again, everybody. Thank you for being part of this symposium, and I hope you all have a wonderful afternoon, and we look forward to seeing you again online and in person. Bye, everyone.